I am tempted to despair at the failure of language to stretch, bend, and wrap itself around such naked cruelty. Surely we have reached a point when everything that can be said has been said and everything that should be done has not been done. The suspension of donor funding to the utterly essential lifeline for Palestinians enduring a genocide will go down in the annals of history as one of the most calculated episodes of naked cruelty in modern times. The decision is undeniable, utterly crystal clear evidence that white supremacy will crush anyone who dares to threaten geopolitical alliances that serve imperial interests. It will use people of colour who tick intersectionality boxes to destroy you. It will use people who profess to be progressive and human rights loving to crush you. It will use white feminists to starve you. The exterminating will and power of white supremacy will be deployed against those who dare to threaten the international rules-based order. If you dare to use the United Nations to hold Israel to account, then you will be treated as having bitten the hand that feeds you, and you will literally no longer be fed. What can one say? At this moment, I turn to my father.
My name is Adnan Abdel Fattah. I was born in Burqa, Nablus, Palestine in 1945. I'm a retired senior research scientist in the field of aerodynamic research. It all started in 1964 with this offer of a scholarship from UNRWA, which I cherish all the time since 1964.
My father is older than the state of Israel, and like every Palestinian, he is a living archive of resistance, of living testimony, flesh, bone, muscle, memory, trauma, survival, a living embodiment of ongoing Nakba and resistance, ongoing defiance, imagination, resilience against genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism, and every other intellectualized, clever, fancy word we weave to describe the stain on humanity that is the state of Israel. For over 5 decades, from Kuwait to Egypt to so-called Australia, my father kept that yellow torn parchment from UNRWA, offering him a scholarship. It is a testament to the refusal of Palestinians to be treated as disembodied from the decisions, conditions, and institutions created and imposed by governments and elites. It shows a demand to hold language and words to account. Palestinian refugees, stateless, right of return, agency, United Nations. They are not headlines or Middle East studies vocabulary lists. They travel with Palestinians in every moment of their lives. Genocidal wars are waged against people who refuse erasure. Genocide attempts to bomb, destroy, and starve a people as a process of erasing their past, present, and future. And Palestinians prove over and over again that they refuse erasure. They will continue to remember, to document, to testify, even as they face the lethal might of the Western white supremacist military machine. They have the receipts of their indomitable will and dignity. Since 1948, my father and all Palestinians have and continue to refuse to be destroyed, refuse surrender. They refuse defeat or despair, refuse to cede their power and agency to the powers and agencies that seek to dominate and contain them. When the children of Gaza held a press conference, they told the world, we want to live as the other children live. Our killing is happening in front of the world. If we must say never again, let it be never again will we allow for a world in which a child has to hold a press conference to plead that they are worthy of life. And so we remain committed to resistance, to speaking, to marching, to demand the funding be reinstated, to disrupting, to writing, to testifying, to the power offered by our actions and words to fight, rally, organise, refuse silence or defeat in the face of white supremacy.
My name is Camila Hawthorn. I'm an associate professor of sociology and critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz. I'm also a member of Faculty for Justice in Palestine and National Alumni for Palestine, a collective calling on our alma maters to protect academic freedom and divest from military contractors that aid and abet genocide across the globe. I am sending this message to express my horror that the United States and about a dozen other governments have announced that they will cut off funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, the primary facilitator for humanitarian aid in Gaza. This morally bankrupt decision comes on the heels of the International Court of Justice's ruling that Israel must ensure that aid and services reach Palestinians. Cutting off aid to a trapped civilian population, half of whom are children, a population that has been systematically denied food, water, sanitation, power infrastructure, and medical supplies is a genocidal tactic, what the United Nations Convention would call the deliberate infliction on a group conditions of life that are calculated to bring about its physical destruction. We should be defunding the global war machine, defunding imperialism, and defunding militarism, not defunding humanitarian aid.
I want to say a few brief words on genocide complicity, specifically the complicity of Western governments in the genocide of the Palestinian people. Because as Omar Barghouti, founder of the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, has stressed, the most profound ethical obligation in these times is to act to end complicity. Only thus, he says, can we truly hope to end oppression and violence. Western complicity in Israel's genocide against the Palestinians attained a new level on Saturday, 27th of January, the day after the International Court of Justice issued its interim order suggesting Israel is plausibly guilty of genocide. In a calculated response combining deflection and distraction, the United States, along with the UK, Germany, the EU, Japan, France, Switzerland, Canada, the Netherlands, Australia, and Italy, suspended all funding to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, the UN's refugee aid lifeline for Palestine. This they did on the basis of Israel's claim that a small number of UNRWA's staff were involved in the Hamas attacks on October the 7th. We've seen no public evidence to support this claim, and nor, I suspect, have the governments who nonetheless raced at Israel and the US's behest to inflict conditions of life on the Palestinian population calculated to further reduce them to a bare struggle for the basics of life, food, water, and shelter. On the 27th of January, the BBC led its news reporting on these unevidenced allegations. Former diplomat Craig Murray timed this at 8 minutes, far more extensive than the coverage the BBC gave to the ICJ interim ruling that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. UNRWA is the primary vehicle through which food and welfare services are delivered to destitute Palestinians. It employs around 30,000 Palestinians, 13,000 of whom are based in the Gaza Strip. UNRWA runs schools which provide basic education and lend dignity and credence to Palestinian history. It provides jobs in a region where unemployment is devastatingly high. It has invested in the vital infrastructure of education and healthcare. And as Jonathan Cook has argued, it has kept alive the moral case for a Palestinian right of return. Now, all of these are anathema to Israel's state organizational goal of a Jewish supremacist state in the whole of historic Palestine, a goal which is predicated upon the elimination of the indigenous population, as with all settler colonial states. The timing of Israel's claims about UNRWA immediately after the ICJ ruling is surely not coincidental, but more significant and more unconscionable than deflecting attention away from the court's ruling is that the decision by Western states to starve UNRWA of funds is also a calculated decision to starve and reduce the Palestinian people to what Claudia Card, in her analysis of genocide, has described as social death. As the World Health Organization and the World Food Programme attest, these are people who are already in the midst of a humanitarian crisis, with 90% of the world's hungriest people now in Gaza. On January the 4th, former Israeli Foreign Ministry official Noura Erakat declared, and it was all over social media, she said, "It will be impossible to win the war if we do not destroy UNRWA. And this destruction," she said, "must begin immediately." And Israel has long wanted to see an end to UNRWA and has consciously planned and executed a policy to make Gaza uninhabitable. The destruction of UNRWA is a further and critical manifestation of that plan, which will accelerate death-inducing famine and disease. The plan to make Gaza uninhabitable is articulated in Israel's 17-year-old Dahia doctrine, a doctrine premised on laying waste to a defined enemy area through overwhelming and disproportionate force so as to weaken the population to the point where mere survival completely supersedes resistance. With all the evidence available to them of the catastrophe that Israel has wreaked on Gaza's civilian population, its infrastructure and environment, Western governments, many of whom have voted against or abstained from supporting a ceasefire, are now actively contributing to the genocidal systematic weakening of the Gazan population. Along with arms sales, the provision of aid and diplomatic cover to Israel, and the ideological support required to sustain this genocide, our own states are, in the language of the 1948 Genocide Convention, joining Israel in deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
Imagine a pregnant woman has sought refuge in a foreign country to the land of her birth. Her husband dies fighting the occupation. The child is born an orphan. Then years later, the occupier says the child can't return, can't visit his father's grave, his ancestral home. As hurtful, the government where the child and the mother found refuge agrees they can't go back. Now imagine the kid is Ukrainian. No Western country or leader would ever tell that kid he can't go back to the Ukraine. Israel says this to every Nakba Palestinian wherever they may have been forced out to. To remain Jewish, Israel is adamant that Palestinians will never return. We know that we will return. Israel sees UNRWA's validation of the Palestinian identity and right to return as a threat to its ethno-nationalist racist state and has for decades sought to vilify, defund and dismantle UNRWA. Israel exists in the way that it does as an apartheid state because of the impunity the West gives it. Diplomatic cover, media cover, sporting and cultural cover. Racist colonial countries and colonizer countries like Australia were founded in the same manner Israel was founded, right down to the lies they said about the land. On this continent, the term was terra nullius, nobody's land. In Palestine, as we know, Zionists claimed it was a land without people for a people without land. Even with all we know, with just how embedded Western imperial racism, how invested it is in this colonial enterprise, I'm ashamed to admit I was surprised. Mere moments after the International Court of Justice ruled that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide. Genocide, the deliberate killing of a large number of people with the aim of destroying that nation or group. That mere moments after these words were uttered, the West and my government's response to plausible genocide by Israel was not to sanction Israel, not to demand an immediate ceasefire, dispatch humanitarian aid or peacekeepers, not the colonial West. Our automatic colonial response to Israel's allegations is to pause UNRWA funding. We will stop aid to Palestinians when the people of Gaza need it most. In 2016, Mohammed al-Halabi was accused by Israel of diverting funds to Hamas. World Vision and the Australian government's reviews found no evidence to support the charges. Israel provided no evidence, but still, Mohammed al-Halabi was convicted in an Israeli court and sentenced to 12 years in jail. This latest evidence is supplied by the same Israeli crew that bought you beheaded babies, weaponized claims of sexual violence, that they didn't kill the 4 Abu Bakr boys as they ran across the beach in Gaza in 2014. They didn't shoot Mohammed al-Durra in 2000. They didn't bomb the UN compound in Kano in 1996. And if you suggest otherwise, well, spin the wheel. You guessed it, you're an anti-Semite. Given Israel's form, given that it has weaponized the most basic essentials for life in Gaza, and that it is facing grave and serious genocide charges before the highest court on earth, why would we give these allegations any credibility? It's beyond shameful. In Gaza today, UNRWA represents the only lifeline the population has, from food and shelter to care and hope. This support and the courage and persistence of Gazans are literally the only things keeping the population from perishing under these unimaginable conditions. With all the ongoing violence, it's important to remember that for Palestinians, UNRWA offers lifelines to our identities. The agency not only advocates for Palestinians and their right to return to their homes, but it also acts as a safekeeper of historical family records, allowing grandparents and their children to ensure their Palestinian heritage is accounted for, recognised, even in our exile. And this is why Israel and its accomplices, a compliant West, demand that UNRWA is killed off. The racist notion that a 2,000-year-old claim for Jewish right of return is not only superior to a Palestinian's 75-year right of return, but also that the Jewish right is exclusive and negates ours. This funding freeze is most immediately an attack on more than 2 million Palestinians, among them our loved ones in Gaza. It's a threat to their very survival and safety. It's a betrayal of our shared humanity. We must defund genocide, not UNRWA.
Ani kinawaya, girgabiju na denawema, kinagachinish na bekogaming na donjaba, na gojawani megwado da, bidas musake na dijnakaras. Canada is founded upon the genocide of Indigenous nations. It removed Indigenous peoples from our homelands through murder, imposed starvation and poverty, harm, forced sterilization, and the removal of generations of children from families and into the residential school system from 1880 to 1996, where they were tortured, starved, raped, beaten, prohibited from speaking their language and practicing their religion, and where many of them died. There are currently more children in the child welfare system than at the height of the residential school system. Indigenous women, girls, transgender, gender diverse, and two-spirit people continue to go missing at an alarming and disproportionate rate. And despite making up only 4% of the population in Canada, Indigenous women account for 42% of all federally sentenced and incarcerated women in the country. From the Indian Act to the creation and maintenance of the reserve system to the police that show up when we are defending our lands from pipelines, golf courses, clear cuts, and mining, Canada supports genocide because Canada exists because of genocide. International law didn't prevent it, the UN didn't prevent it, and Canada's legal system for the most part supports it. The Canadian state has engaged in a process of truth and reconciliation, and watching Prime Minister Trudeau and Minister Jallet support Israel, support genocide, and now withdraw UNRWA funding means both truth and reconciliation were always a sham. We are still here, and we are still fighting, and to my Palestinian siblings in Gaza, in the West Bank, in 48, and in the diaspora, I will fight for you too. The settler state that dispossesses and occupies our lands supports Israel in dispossessing and occupying Palestine. I encourage Indigenous peoples worldwide to visit indigenousforpalestine.org to sign our letter of solidarity and to commit to the Palestinian call to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel and all institutions complicit in Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. I encourage you all to organize mutual aid for Palestine and for Gaza, to demand freedom for political prisoners, and to support land back and the right of return for Palestinians. I demand that Prime Minister Trudeau reinstate Canada's UNRWA funding and demand the return of Mansour Schuman, a Palestinian Canadian citizen believed to be abducted by the IDF a few days ago. To close, I will echo what Palestinians have been saying for decades. Stop the genocide, end the siege, end the occupation, dismantle apartheid, free Palestine. Miigwech.
On behalf of the Peace People of Belfast, we would like to strongly protest against the withdrawal of funding from UNRWA. This is a retrograde step and totally unfair that this has come about. We congratulate the Irish government for their position of not conforming to this and agreeing to keep their funding going. The situation in Gaza is nothing less than a genocide. I actually seen today how people actually had the nerve to go into a hospital looking for people, whether they were civilians or combatants, is totally irrelevant. This is against every convention, and for people to be talking about people who are giving out aid to people who are struggling to survive in this horrific so-called war, we would like this to come to an end, and we think it's an absolute disgrace on the international community to subjugate the people in the way this has happened. Israel, as an occupying power, have an international duty to look after the people that they have occupied. All we are seeing is out and out suppression, and the peace people in Belfast, who were a major factor in starting the peace process here today, really are in shock at how this continues. We have had a stop in our political process for the last 2 years, but because of the Good Friday Agreement, we stopped the violence for 30 years. Now, why don't the people who are interested in peace in Israel, Palestine, why don't they look at what happened here and take many lessons from it? I think any way that we can help in facilitating this process, we will do that. But as I say, get the funding back. The people need it. People are starving.
Hello, my name is Hafsar Kanjawal, and I'm a Kashmiri academic based in the US. I'm sending my solidarity to the global online rally against the complicity of Western governments in the genocide in Gaza. As a Kashmiri, the Palestinian struggle for liberation and justice is my struggle too. India and Israel are partners in the genocidal occupations of the people of Kashmir and Palestine. India is Israel's largest arms buyer, and both governments share strategies on how to suppress the resistance in each context. Both Kashmiris and Palestinians were subject to the whims of first the British colonial powers and later the colonization of their land, livelihoods, and resources by the Israeli and Indian rule. So many have been killed and have suffered immense tragedies for nearly 8 decades. While of course the histories of the two places are not the same, there are important resonances. Both colonial powers utilize religious mythology to claim exclusive right to being indigenous to a place. Both rewrite history and are fundamentally Islamophobic. Both also position themselves as victims, with Zionists weaponizing anti-Semitism and Hindu nationalists increasingly using Hindu phobia. For Kashmiris, India's complete annexation of Kashmir in 2019, the fear has been that India will follow the Israeli model in Kashmir. Indian officials have already been on the record calling for Israeli-like settlements in Kashmir. Kashmiris fear the West Bankification of Kashmir with Indian settlers, whether they are people from the business community, soldiers, families of soldiers, or laborers, moving in, settlements being created for them, and increased militarized infrastructure around those settlements. Israel also provides India with the most up-to-date technology for surveillance and warfare. Today in Kashmir, the repressive situation is such that Kashmiris who have strongly identified with the Palestinian struggle throughout its history cannot even raise their voice against the genocide. The level of government suppression is so high that people are not able to protest, even using creative means. Local Muslim imams have also been ordered not to speak about what's happening in their Friday sermons. Kashmiri freedom is inextricably connected to Palestinian freedom. What both Kashmir and Palestine show us is not just the limitations of the current international order, but rather the way in which this order itself has played a role in the subjugation of these colonized peoples. It's becoming increasingly evident that there is no hope for these communities under the status quo, and no longer can we simply rely on things like international law, the international community, human rights, or the West. Kashmir and Palestine serve as symbolic and material manifestations of the failure of the European-American civilizational project in its entirety. With their freedom, then, can a new world centering truly on justice, liberation, and equality for all emerge.
The attack on UNRWA is incredibly cynical. On the day that the international community received word and notice that it shouldn't be aiding and abetting genocide, rather than end weapons transfers to the state accused of genocide and plausibly committing it, the United States, in concert with Australia and Canada, waged a campaign against UNRWA and the Palestinians who are most in need of humanitarian aid for survival by now helping to starve them, thereby being complicit in genocide. And I just want to, emphasize that this is as much about a deflection from the ICJ decision, perpetuation of Israel's genocide campaign, and punishment to the UN and its judicial organ, and having the audacity to charge Israel with genocide, as much as it is a continuation of an Israeli goal of invisibilizing Palestinians, not just by saying they don't exist as Palestinians juridically, but also insisting that as there are no refugees and they do not have the right to return, framing them as an existential threat because of the disrupting the demographic balance, and trying to do that through many means, by limiting who's entitled to the right of return, by limiting that temporally, by limiting it geographically. And now what we're seeing is by, trying to decimate the very organ that was established even before UNHCR, the International Refugee Agency that services this population that is in need. It's literally punishing them for continuing to exist and trying to annihilate them through other means.
I'm Sunita Viswanath of Hindus for Human Rights. Thank you for having me here today. Hindus for Human Rights provides a Hindu voice against injustice and support of equality and dignity around the world. While our work primarily focuses on the human rights abuses and crises in South Asia, our faith leads us to care about rights and lives all over our planet. We have been steadfast and vocal in our opposition to the horrific genocide that has taken almost 27,000 lives so far in Gaza. We've consistently called for a ceasefire and joined multiple efforts to get American, Canadian, British, and Australian officials to also formally call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Our stance is grounded strongly in our Hindu belief that every living being is an incarnation of the divine, and so we are all connected in our divinity with each other. And that is why today I cannot stay silent as we witness so many countries pull funding from the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. Palestinians in Gaza are facing famine, lack of clean drinking water, and lack of fuel. If a Palestinian is not killed by a bomb or the denial of medical care, they are killed by hunger, thirst, or cold. These crimes of collective punishment are undeniable acts of genocide. Despite the siege, UNRWA provided a vital lifeline, including critical health care, to Palestinians trapped in Gaza. UNRWA was already struggling to provide services given its severe underfunding. But now the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Finland, Estonia, Japan, Austria, Romania have all announced that they will pull funding for UNRWA. This collective punishment makes these governments, who are some of the biggest donors of UNRWA, directly responsible for the genocide in Gaza. The WHO and Amnesty International have denounced these plans to defund UNRWA, and we join our colleagues advocating for human rights and the millions of protesters in the streets all around the world in our horror at the enthusiastic embrace of and complicity in genocide by many Western governments. When we see this embrace by the West of a fascist Israeli government, including the decision to defund UNRWA, we know this is part of a long battle by the hard right in Israel to make the world forget about Palestine. And they do so by weaponizing the Jewish faith and Jewish identity, despite the fact that anti-Zionism in Jewish communities has existed for as long as Zionism has. This fight for and with Palestinians is deeply personal to me. When I founded Hindus for Human Rights, I did so because I recognized the warning signs in my Hindu community of rising religious nationalism. Hindu nationalism and Islamophobia were already on the rise before 2019, but when Narendra Modi was re-elected Prime Minister, I looked around and saw Hindu Americans loudly embrace his vision to destroy the Indian Republic. They did not care about the violent Islamophobia, including calls to genocide against Muslims by Hindu leaders, or casteism, including anti-Indigenous pogroms. Instead, they embraced it. But I also knew that there must be Hindus who are horrified by what they see. A vision of Hinduism that defies our core tenet that all lives are sacred and divine. I formed Hindus for Human Rights to say, not in our name. Like Jewish Voice for Peace, Hindus for Human Rights organizes the majority community to fight back against the persecution of Muslims, caste-oppressed people, and the many religious and cultural minorities in India. We see the regular dehumanization of Indian Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and Dalits in India, and the Indian American diaspora, and the justification of these horrific acts by prominent groups who say they represent the Hindu community. They've learned to shut down criticism. They insist that any criticism of the fascism we see in India today is Hindu-phobic. Hindu nationalists doxed Indian Americans who spoke out against the genocide in Gaza. Hindu nationalists and Zionists from Modi and Netanyahu all the way down to AIPAC and Hindu American Foundation are learning from each other and working together in shared Islamophobia. Given these warning signs from Hindu nationalists, it is urgent for the world to intervene in India before the Indian government replicates the genocidal actions of Israel. And just like my friends at JVP, who have mobilized thousands of Jews around the world to reject settler colonialism, apartheid, and genocide in the name of Judaism, I am here to say as a Hindu, not in my name. I encourage my fellow Hindus to speak out against Zionism and Hindu nationalism. Without our active rejection of fascist nationalist movements, we cannot truly say never again. It's not complicated. Om Shanti means no to genocide. Om Shanti means ceasefire now. Om Shanti means keep funding UNRWA. Om Shanti. Namaste.
Last Friday, ICJ's historic decision became almost immediately inaudible, or so was Israel when it released allegations against UNRWA workers. France has hastily declared it would halt its funding at the end of February. Hence, France, like other states, has fallen into the trap set for them by Israel government. They will be held complicit in the long run of the tragic consequences of this war and the ongoing genocide. Today, a rally in Brussels is organized by activists of Urgence Palestine and the AFPS, Association France-Palestine Solidarity, to demand that the European Commission demands an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, prevents any member states from defunding UNRWA, and therefore resume and increase the humanitarian aid, and implements a BDS policy, starting with sanctions and divestment in military trade and cooperation. Many of these actions have moved away from the Zionist schemes fomented with its Western accomplices to make visible what is at stake. The complete wipeout of a people against the staunch aspiration of the Palestinians to continue to live, sustain the means of their livelihood, and pursue their righteous claim for decolonization, justice, peace, and a sovereign state. Yet, as we know, the colonial powers know how to achieve their goals, as they did in the past with contaminated blankets, alcohol, germs, poisoned wells, and destroyed crops. Algeria, Abya Yala, Turtle Island, Kanaki, New Caledonia, and many more places across the earth have undergone such duress, witnessed countless loss and deaths, and still have survived it all. Yet this time, all the cutting-edge technology is used to such aim, and the damage caused is already immeasurable and irreparable due to the laboratory firm that Israel has become, granted through a huge amount of money and massive technology exchange and support by the countries where many of us live. The European Union, especially France, know that they stand by Israel as vast segments of their citizens are against such stance and denounce the complicity of their government with the criminal acts perpetrated in Gaza. Unlike their government, looking for any possible distraction, they do not turn a blind eye on what is happening. Yet this is far from enough to gain the overwhelming support Palestine needs to prevail. South Africa and the ICJ decision have made a huge step towards that aim, but it is jeopardized, and that must be exposed and changed. This is what obliges us and will be judged when the deliberately maintained interference is dissipated by the forces of solidarity struggles with the Palestinian people. Will we live up to the challenge of standing by the Palestinian people, facing the colonial oppression, and voicing our support to their struggle and right to self-determination? My ancestors once won the world support for their independence and freedom in Algeria. I try to speak to this as the descendant of Algerian freedom fighters, as a binational citizen of a country, France, that colonized my people and intended to make it impossible for them to win their sovereignty. France, whose parliament adopted the infamous IHRA conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. France that outlawed for weeks, under the pretense of a threat to public order and the possible unleash of anti-Semitic mottos, the rallies and demonstrations supporting the Palestinian people in Gaza and in the occupied West Bank, and denouncing the complicity of France on the onslaught on Gaza. I speak to name and shame France as an accomplice of the ongoing genocide through arming the state of Israel by supporting its necropolitics, its impunity, by too often acting as its unflinching PR and its latest decision regarding UNRWA. I speak as an Algerian French, as a humble friend of Camila, who once joined me and my family in a phone conversation with all Palestinian refugees on the street in Amman, who were exhilarated to speak to Camila بالضبط, the hero of the anti-colonial Algerian war and whose liberation from the French jails they once supported. I speak as a collective joint voice addressing French state racism against Arabs, Blacks, Muslims, Roma, that represses its colonial past to better implement its colonial present rule, a state that feels a deep solidarity with Israel as it recognizes in it, whether acknowledged or not, its own colonial conscience as exerted in its suburban, disenfranchised and racialized population, and on its current overseas colonies spread across the globe. When France supports unconditionally Israel, it knows what it means and what it entails. They have long-time ties and common understanding of how to tame the occupied people, especially if they are Arab and Muslim. Yet the occupying force has decided to gear up towards complete elimination, as we are witnessing right now. They must be fully fought relentlessly. I join major voices to give a minority report on this overwhelming issue at the historic moment we are living. Thank you.
My name is Cynthia Franklin, and I come to you from occupied Hawaii, where I teach at the University of Hawaii. Defunding UNRWA, Noura Erakat points out, is a re-upping of Trump's 2018 policy. The timing is, of course, no accident. It is a distraction from and a belligerent refusal of the ICJ ruling that find charges against Israel of genocide plausible. The U.S. is not only continuing but intensifying and doubling down on its participation in settler colonialism and now what we can clearly call genocide. The reasons given for this withdrawal of funding, of involvement by 12 of the agency's 30,000 staff members in October 7th, are yet another instance of the U.S.'s participation in Israel's collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, who has promised a full investigation into these charges, has noted the immense irresponsibility of sanctioning an agency and the entire community it serves because of allegations of criminal acts against some individuals. Moreover, the statements regarding UNRWA members' involvement came from Palestinian detainees under conditions of torture. We all know how very unreliable such confessions are. We also see how little Israel's practices of torture matter to the US. And we also know how little evidence matters to Biden, with his record of making things up as he goes along and taking hold of the most unsubstantiated claims to suit his unqualified support for Israel. We also know that since October 7th, Israel has killed over 150 UNRWA staff, along with healthcare workers, teachers, artists, children, bakers, and everyday people trying to live lives under a brutal 16-year-long blockade and resisting intolerable conditions that have come to meet textbook definitions of genocide. To summarize, the U.S. responding to allegations against 12 individuals is prepared to withdraw funding from an organization that Israel is already targeting and to leave millions throughout Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria without food, water, medicine, and basic supplies. In doing so, in flagrant violation of international law and the recent ICJ rulings, the U.S. government participates in genocide. When I have spent time in the West Bank, I've continuously heard calls for solidarity, not charity. UNRWA, which upholds the right of return and advocates for a just and lasting solution for Palestinians, is a UN agency that Palestinians in Gaza must depend upon for basic necessities and for education, as they've been held hostage to what I consider to be the true cycle of violence. Israel bombing them and decimating their infrastructure every few years, then allowing just enough aid from NGOs and government agencies and charitable organizations to partially rebuild what Israel will soon again destroy with the full sponsorship of the US. To disrupt this already violent cycle and lay siege to these organizations is yet another indicator of what we are seeing in Gaza. That is an acceleration of genocide, one in which the US is a direct participant. Although it is hard indeed to find hope when looking to courts and government officials, the people rising for Palestine within Gaza, across Palestine, and across the world provide a counterweight to this hopelessness. On Sunday, I joined thousands in marching through the streets of Waikiki for a deoccupied Hawaii and Palestine. We proclaimed Ku Kia'i Palestina in recognition that those who stood in protection of Native Hawaii's sacred mountain, Mauna Awakea, under the rallying cry, Ku Kia'i Mauna, now stand with Palestine. The banner I held from the group I am part of, Students and Faculty for Justice in Palestine at the University of Hawaii, proclaimed, "From olive tree to olive tree, we stand in solidarity," a line from Pai'aina, a song of solidarity by Ihiloni Lasconia and Kawila Mahi that Kawila performed later that day. I look to the day when an agency such as UNRWA will no longer be necessary. In the meantime, those of us standing for Palestine must protest this defunding with every fiber of our being as part of the struggle for a pre-Palestine and a world without settler colonialism and genocide.
I'm Sharika Thiranagama, and like everybody else today, I am angry that a genocide is going on before our eyes in Palestine, in Gaza, and also in the West Bank. One as a fully fledged assault, the other carried out with targeted intensity and horror. And I'm angry that as a British Sri Lankan living in the US, that the US and UK are complicit in this genocide by supplying arms, support, and moral cover. I am angry that the prime agency for supporting the Palestinians, UNRWA, an organization that has always been historically opposed by the Israeli state, is being denied funding by the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and other countries in the wake of an ICJ ruling that explicitly said that more humanitarian aid should be flowing into Palestine. We all know that the genocide in Palestine didn't just start in October 2023. We know that since 1948, Palestinians have been denied their rights, their homes, their existence, and they have endured unimaginable human rights violations. And the Palestinian struggle is emblematic of this cruel century that has not only propelled ideas of justice and freedom, it has radically restricted who can be allowed to have them and enforces militarily. And sometimes watching the national media, living here in the US, I feel almost dizzy, like blue is red and yellow is white, because it's like the evidence of our eyes that we see being reported by Palestinian journalists almost daily is being completely obscured and transformed into propaganda for the Israeli states. In newspapers that I used to rely upon to cover the world, newspapers and TV that I wanted to actually contribute truth to my life. And in response to the evidence of this genocide, all we hear about is Hamas's acts of October the 7th, and that they necessitate wholesale slaughter of a community, its institutions, its very past and future. How can any person accept such a rationale? How can we live in a world that accepts such a rationale? And the truth is that we don't. All around the world, I see that people gather to say not in our name. And I see that even while our politicians ignore us, that people say no. I mean, I've heard such rationales before for collective punishment, that a whole community should be held and laid waste for the acts of a military organization, because I grew up in a war in Sri Lanka. As a child, as a Tamil, we endured bombardment, killing, and disappearance by the Sri Lankan state, the Indian army, and also by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. And for those who think that war and collective punishment is a just and justifiable response, I think you have lost something very precious inside yourself. You have lost your humanity. Our state, our Sri Lankan state, thought that Tamil lives were so cheap that it killed Tamils in their thousands in 2009. Now, my mother was a human rights activist, a doctor, and a university teacher. And we lay night by night at the time of the Indian occupation of northern Sri Lanka, never knowing whether we would see the morning. And when I think of Gaza, men, women, children, I think of those days and nights, and I wish I could say anything to them that would mean anything, something in this senseless time. Now, I'm also a university teacher, and I have now watched the universities in Gaza be destroyed. Not only the buildings, but the people, the students, and the staff, from those who teach to those who clean and lock doors, who are all part of what makes a university community. I mean, we don't even need to pick out the university I start with that, because that's my job, that's my colleagues. But every single person in Palestine lives under the threat of death from the Israeli state. And the Israeli politicians and the IDF openly advertise that every person in Palestine lives under their threat. My mother, Rajni Thiranagama, wrote in a letter in 1989 that life means so much more than to be snuffed out like a candle flame. And we see every day candle flames extinguished by the might of an Israeli army and government. And I say no to supporting genocide. I send my solidarity to the Palestinian people, and I hope that life, love, freedom, and justice may flourish one day from the river to the sea.
So let's get this right. The Israeli state has been found plausibly guilty of genocide by the International Criminal Court, otherwise known as the World Court, genocide against the Palestinian people. The British government and the US and other governments are now withdrawing funding from UNRWA on the basis of evidence provided by that same Israeli state. Not only does this mean those states are complicit in genocide, thanks to the arming and surveillance and giving of other techniques to the Israeli state. But they are also withholding the basic necessities of life from Palestinian people. This is abhorrent, it's disgraceful, and it should be of concern to all of us because it demonstrates an utter carelessness about human life, and we're all humans.
Hello, I'm Alice Rothschild, a physician, author, and filmmaker and Palestine solidarity activist. I have been curating a weekly report on the health and human rights consequences of the war on Gaza since the October 7th attack. I'm deeply appalled that with the Shin Bet accusation of somewhere around 12 UN employees being involved in the October 7th attack, the number of countries, including my own, the United States, has decided to suspend aid to UNRWA. This is really unconscionable as Palestinians in Gaza face famine, starvation, lack of housing, with some 70% of people displaced and tens of thousands of dead and injured. It is very striking to me that when the International Court of Justice asks the Israeli government and military to stop doing genocidal acts and to provide for humanitarian aid to the population that they have just slaughtered and dispossessed, that the next thing that happens is that this accusation is announced by the Israeli government. I deeply wonder why the same countries that are so appalled by this accusation, which is an unconscionable act if that's what happened, but there are 13,000 UNRWA employees in Gaza and 12 people participating in this assault is not appropriate to then cut off funding for UNRWA. And I wonder why the international community does not cut off funding for the Israeli military when it is committing repeated war crimes over the last over 3 months. So I stand in solidarity with the people of Gaza, and I deeply urge the countries that have suspended their support of UNRWA, which is not adequate to provide the needs of the Gazan people, that this support is resumed, and that the international community takes seriously the need to keep Gazans from starving to death and freezing to death and dying of infectious disease, and that the international community also works to create an immediate ceasefire. Thank you.
You don't need me to tell you the people of Gaza are dying. The ones who are not being blown up are dying of hunger, very literally, not figuratively. Under the circumstances, what kind of human being wants to shut down the main humanitarian organization that's trying to keep the people of Gaza alive? How can anybody be outraged at UNRWA because of what a handful of its employees did, and not be outraged at the Israelis who are committing genocide? How can you want to shut down the organization that is trying to keep people alive and not be outraged at the organization, Israel, that's trying to kill them? It's as if the so-called civilized world has lost its collective mind.
Hi, my name is Sarah Gemma, and I'm the MPP here in Hamilton Center. I'm sorry that I couldn't make the rally live, but I wanted to send you a few words across. We know that right now there are about 30,000 Palestinians who've been killed as a result of this genocide by the state of Israel. And we know that there's about 1.9 million Palestinians that have been internally displaced from their homelands. And we know that people right now are without water and food and are suffering from starvation, this manufactured starvation and famine that has been imposed on these people. And we know that instead of doing something about it, our government continues to make cowardly decisions. Instead of listening to the international ruling by the International Court of Justice and taking leadership from this international court, our government decided to result in collective punishment of Palestinians by withholding humanitarian aid, withholding access to food and water and that kind of financial support. This is a cowardly decision, and Melanie Joly and Justin Trudeau, we all know that you have blood on your hands. Every single one of us who have been calling for an end to this genocide will continue to do so. From outside of these systems and from some of us inside of these systems, we're going to continue to do what we can to hold you accountable for these decisions. For all of you who are listening right now, continue to do what you can to pressure your elected officials to reverse their decision to cut off the UNRWA funding. We can do it. We know that these elected officials care a lot about their votes and the votes that they can maintain. Continue to pressure them. Continue to say that we are not okay supporting this genocide. Again, I'm sorry that I couldn't be here in person to share some words with you all. My heart's with everybody in Palestine right now. Free Palestine.
My name is Intan Paramadita. I'm an Indonesian author and I'm currently based in Sydney, Australia. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. This morning, I read a book by Noura Erakat and George Lafey, who talked about Palestinian cinema as roadblock movies. Borders are inseparable from the Palestinian space and identity. In many Palestinian films, wherever the characters go, they will encounter fences, checkpoints, soldiers, oppression, and even death. Road movies celebrate mobility. Roadblock movies signal that there's no way out. It is a death world. This is what we've been forced to watch as a global community, a roadblock cinema, where all efforts to mobilize support for the Palestinian people are blocked by the Israeli state and its allies. The Western government's decision to defund the UN Humanitarian Aid Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, is an attempt to block aid to Gaza and to undermine the international solidarity movement. The announcement was made within 48 hours after the International Court of Justice made a statement that acknowledges plausible genocide in Gaza. This maneuver sent a clear message. Western imperial powers are invincible, and they can invalidate any forms of global South solidarity. This is the same message that they sent when South Africa's legal team delivered their presentation at the ICJ hearing. The US and the UK, supported by, among others, Canada, Australia, and the Netherlands, bombed Yemen, another country that showed their support to Palestine. These are colonial disruptions that distract us from the ICJ and the Global South resistance. These are facilitated by Western media. Roadblocks are colonial tools to crush our capacity to imagine that a different future is possible. We must continue rejecting these narratives of roadblocks. We must question and pressure all institutions, the media, corporations, academic and cultural institutions that participate in blocking support for the Palestinian people. We must demand their responsibility for clearing the road for Israel to continue committing genocide. Around 27,000 people have been killed, and 66,000 people are wounded. The healthcare system in Gaza is collapsing. People are in dire need of food, water, sanitation. We must keep demanding our governments to stop this catastrophe. Defund Israel. Defund genocide. Free Palestine.
Israel's terrorism accusations against 12 out of 13,000 UNRWA staff members in the Gaza Strip do not justify demonizing UNRWA or suspending its funding. Why is it necessary to support UNRWA? UNRWA is the most capable and legitimate UN-mandated agency able to operate and provide humanitarian aid to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. UNRWA has the most presence, infrastructure, and personnel of any other humanitarian agency in the Gaza Strip. Funding UNRWA is a necessity to prevent genocide and to adhere to the ICJ measures on genocide. Funding UNRWA is not a favor. It is an international obligation towards Palestinians. Ensuring UNRWA's continued operation in the Gaza Strip will save Palestinian lives and ease their suffering. The bottom line, in the current genocidal war, defunding UNRWA is intended to eliminate UNRWA and replace it with an Israeli-controlled entity that will hold Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and their humanitarian and political fate hostage to Israel's whims. UNRWA is our right until return.
Today I draw the tears that slide off of cheeks and drain into the sewers of our attention. You cannot see them because they speak a dialect of pain and suffering, foreign to our ears. Today I draw the screams as they echo soundlessly, endlessly, never finding a compassionate heart to reflect off. Today I draw a child whose smile is hollow from the friendship of war, war that sleeps underneath the skin, seeps into dreams and bloodstreams. They place the weight of peace on my shoulders, but I am not the dove of peace, and I apologize, Palestine, for those who have forgotten your name and turned deaf to your calls, for the dusting picture frames and the pain that vibrates within your blessed walls, the foreign military boots in your mosques and the foreign hands caressing your lands, for peace treaties that come at too high a cost, for the political games that bring only loss. I apologize for the refugees, the widows, the detainees, the shriveled meadows. I apologize, and today I find my voice to speak. Today, I draw the rocket's shadow, the men's bravery, the women's patience, the rows of cemeteries. For those waiting for help, those praying, not to sleeping leaders, but to God. They pray as they fall, 100 dead, 500 dead, 1,000 dead, 2,000 dead. Silence. The world is silent, and the resolutions are ashamed to speak. They call on me to bring peace, but peace cannot come without justice. So beware of a dove that has witnessed too much. Beware of the child I raise with a rock in his hand and a dream. They call on me to bring peace, but I am the dove of revolution.